Elizabeth Woodville's role in the Lambert Simnel rebellion has been questioned many times, but only in recent history and almost exclusively within Ricardian circles. Bertram Fields, for example, suggested in 1998 that Simnel was merely a kind of straw man sent to test the waters for one of the princes in the Tower, who would then arrive in England with the real army to restore the House of York to the throne. Elizabeth, naturally, was said to stand by her son. Even for modern-day Ricardians, however, this theory proved too far-fetched. Philippa Langley and Matthew Lewis, for instance, now maintain that Simnel was in fact Edward V. The Tudor government had declared that the boy claimed to be Edward Plantagenet, the son of George, Duke of Clarence, who at that time was eking out a pitiful existence as a prisoner in the Tower. Lewis argues that Elizabeth Woodville's enforced retreat to Bermondsey Monastery and the confiscation of her estates can be explained by her support for her son. Langley, in her essay on Simnel for the Richard III Society, wisely avoids mentioning the Queen of Edward IV at all. Nonetheless, the arguments put forward are untenable. I must confess, I have to restrain myself here from resorting to abusive language. So much of what modern Ricardians write seems designed purely to uphold the prestige of Richard III. In her book on the Missing Princes Project, Langley accepts gaps as wide as the Grand Canyon in order to make Simnel into Edward V, because if that were true, it would mean he could not have been killed by Richard III. So today, we are faced with two entirely implausible ideas. First, that Lambert Simnel was, or was intended to represent, Edward V, and second, that Elizabeth Woodville had any part in this rebellion. Welcome or welcome back to Lemmy History. In the coming weeks, we will take a closer look at Elizabeth Woodville's life during the reign of Henry VII on this channel. Today's topic is Simnel. A second video will examine her move to Bermondsey Abbey. The final part will focus on her memories of the princes in the Tower. Originally, I planned to produce only the final part, but I realized I first needed to clarify certain matters in order to make that episode comprehensible. Simnel, his claimed identity, and the alleged involvement of the old queen are subjects so frequently discussed that they also warrant a standalone video. For the sake of transparency, I am convinced Lambert Simnel was an impostor. I am equally certain he impersonated George's son, after initially being intended to play the role of Richard of Shrewsbury. Two reasons are decisive. First, Henry VII paraded the real Edward Plantagenet in public and allowed people to speak with him. This effectively removed any support for Simnel in England, leading to the rebellion's collapse in the summer of 1487. If Simnel had in reality been, or was supposed to be, Edward V, there would have been no reason to parade Edward Plantagenet through the streets. Second, Perkin Warbeck made no mention of Simnel. He did not acknowledge him as his brother. On the contrary, he stated that the real Edward V had died in the Tower. With the genuine Edward Plantagenet, he even planned an escape from the Tower. And for the record, anyone who believes that the Tudors, whether in the person of Margaret Beaufort or Henry VII, were responsible for the deaths of the princes in the Tower, cannot simultaneously argue that Simnel was one of the sons of Edward IV. At the outset, the following must be made clear. There is not a single source that directly connects Lambert Simnel with Elizabeth Woodville. We know nothing whatsoever about how the former queen regarded the boy who claimed to be the rightful king of England. Matthew Lewis attempts to address this absence by pointing to the 3rd of March, 1487. On that date, the Privy Council met to discuss events in Ireland, where Simnel appeared to be gaining support. At the same meeting, they also addressed the transfer of Elizabeth Woodville's property to her daughter and her relocation to the convent grounds. Lewis states literally that another outcome of this meeting was the decision concerning the former queen. By presenting both matters together, he clearly seeks to imply that Elizabeth Woodville was punished for her support. He writes, "Many subsequent writers have believed that Elizabeth was being dealt with because she was suspected of involvement in the Lambert Simnel affair. The problem is that the timelines do not align. Elizabeth Woodville moved to the convent grounds on the 12th of February, 1487, 5 days before the rebellion officially began. On the 29th of February, 1487, Edward Plantagenet was displayed to the public. The formal transfer of her property occurred on the 1st of May, 1487. On the 24th of May, 1487, Simnel was crowned King Edward in Dublin. Moreover, Elizabeth had already rented the abbot's house for 40 years in the summer of 1486. Even Ricardian historians, such as Anne Sutton and Livia Visserfuchs, therefore, believe she withdrew to the monastery voluntarily. After all, both the preparations and the actual move took place before the rebellion broke out. Lewis could equally have cited the 2nd of February 1487, when a Privy Council meeting discussed the very same topics as reported by Polydore Virgil. This would at least have referred to the council's deliberations prior to her relocation. The reason he does not becomes apparent when we examine the actual passage. Among other matters, Elizabeth, the widow of King Edward, was deprived by the decree of the same council of all her possessions. This was done because she had made her peace with King Richard, had placed her daughters at his disposal, and had, by leaving sanctuary, broken her promise to those, mainly of the nobility, who had, at her own most urgent entreaty, forsaken their own English property and fled to Henry in Brittany, the latter having pledged himself to marry her elder daughter Elizabeth. Virgil attributes the loss of her property to Henry's anger over her compromise with Richard III, not to any supposed support for Simnel. He makes no mention of her move to the monastery, though he does indirectly note that she thereafter led a wretched life. To put the matter into perspective, we have no source that links Elizabeth Woodville to Simnel. We do, however, have Virgil, who provides a different explanation for the loss of her estates. Furthermore, the chronology does not fit any claim that her relocation was caused by the Simnel affair. The fundamental decision seems to have been taken in the summer of 1486, when she leased the abbot's house for 40 years, a time when she had only just regained her possessions and when no one had yet heard of Simnel. To be fair, this does not prove she could not have supported Simnel later. It does mean, however, that her move and the transfer of her property to her daughter cannot be used as evidence of such support. Incidentally, Virgil's reference to Richard III as the cause of her loss makes it all the more necessary to produce an additional video examining in detail the reasons behind her relocation. Naturally, the question arises, why would Elizabeth Woodville support Simnel at all? She had much to lose: her possessions, her position, and the stability of her family. Her daughters were well integrated into the Tudor dynasty, and her eldest, Elizabeth of York, was queen. The only reason repeatedly offered by various authors is that Simnel was one of her sons, specifically Edward V. This is why we must examine Simnel's supposed identity. The earliest source to provide any concrete information about him is the posthumous accusation of treason against John de la Pole from 1487. There, we learn that Simnel was about 10 years old. This alone effectively rules out Edward V, who would have been nearly 16. The difference in appearance between a 10-year-old and a 16-year-old is considerable. Even Richard of Shrewsbury, at nearly 14, seems improbable. Edward Plantagenet, however, was 12 years old in 1487, a far more plausible match. As a note, in some cases, his age is recorded as 13. This stems from the fact that he was born on the 21st of February, 1475, according to our modern calendar. But at the time, the new year began in March. Thus, his date of birth was then calculated as 1474, leading to later confusion. The first source to identify Simnel as one of the princes in the Tower is Bernard André, who was in the service of Henry VII and worked as a Tudor court poet for Prince Arthur. The key sentence in translation reads, "So now a deception was devised among them, and the rumour spread that the second son of Edward had been crowned king in Ireland." Some have speculated that André confused Simnel with Warbeck, but I disagree. He explicitly refers to a coronation in Ireland, a ceremony Warbeck never received. More importantly, he identifies the boy as the second son, Richard of Shrewsbury. In her research for the Missing Princes project, Philippa Langley uncovered a receipt from a weapons supplier for Simnel's army. This document likewise refers to a son of King Edward, without specifying which one. Langley considers this strong evidence, arguing that the seller had no incentive to lie. Yet the notion that a French arms dealer could have recognized one of the princes in the Tower, who had never left the British Isles until the fateful summer of 1483, is highly implausible. She also neglects to note that the son could be Richard rather than Edward. This omission is, in my view, linked to the Ricardian belief that Warbeck was genuine, and in his case, there is no dispute that he claimed to be Richard of Shrewsbury. If Warbeck was Richard, then Simnel could not also be. Lewis, for his part, points out that Simnel called himself King Edward, not King Richard. Here, however, a new difficulty emerges. In York, there survives a letter from Simnel to the city, signed Edward VI. If genuine, this would mean he was not claiming to be Edward V, and worse still, that Simnel acknowledged Edward V as dead. Most of Simnel's surviving letters carry no regnal number, merely King Edward. Lewis therefore suspects later tampering in the York archives. But one must ask, why would the Tudors bother to falsify a single letter while leaving others unaltered, thereby undermining their own credibility? The York letter reads, "By the King, to our trusty and well-beloved the Mayor and his brethren and communalty of our city of York, trusty and well-beloved, we greet you well, and forsamoch as we been common within this, our realm not only by God's grace to attain our right of the same, but also for the relief and well of our said realm, you and all other our true subjects, which hath been greatly inuried and oppressed in default of noun ministration of good rules and justice, desire therefore, and in our right hurtly wise pray you, that in this behalf ye will show unto us your good aids and favories, and where we, and such power as we have brought with us by mean of travail of the sea, and upon the land been greatly wearied and laboured, it will like you that we may have relief and ease of lodging and vitales within our city there, and so to depart and truly pay for that at we shall take, and in your so doing ye shall do thing unto us of right acceptable pleaser, and for the same find us your good and sovereign Lord at all times hereafter, and of your dispositions herein to ascertain us by this bringer. Ye vene under our signet at Masham the Viti day of June." Notably, there is no claim here that he was a son of King Edward IV, a statement we would expect to be prominently displayed. Perkin Warbeck never tired of emphasizing that very point as the foundation of his legitimacy. We might also expect Margaret of York and King Maximilian to have promoted such a claim as they did with Warbeck. Instead, the strongest piece of evidence in this direction is the aforementioned receipt found by Langley, and it was Maximilian who had paid for the weapons. Thus, to make Simnel into the missing king from the Tower, we must first overlook Edward's true age, and then rely on allegedly forged documents. We must also assume that the entire population of London conveniently forgot that Edward Plantagenet had been publicly paraded before them. If Simnel were Edward V, he must also have repressed or ignored the fact that the rebellion's leaders were Sir Francis Lovell, Richard III's closest friend, John de la Pole, Richard's presumed heir in 1485, and Thomas Fitzgerald, Lord Chancellor of Ireland under Richard III, who retained the office under Henry VII. Among his notable English supporters was Bishop Robert Stillington, who had provided Richard III with the legal pretext to claim the crown. Edward would therefore have been placing his trust in the very men who had betrayed him, stripped him of his crown, and declared him illegitimate. This defies reason, just as it is irrational to believe that Stillington, having risked everything to establish Edward's illegitimacy, would later help restore him to the throne. Langley sidesteps this problem entirely. Lewis attempts to resolve it by suggesting that John de la Pole, as Richard's heir, would have followed no other leader but Edward V. More than 20 years ago, however, Wagner gave the more plausible answer. In private, he probably saw his own accession as the ultimate goal of the enterprise. The Simnel Rebellion was an uprising by men who had fallen with Richard III. We are now expected to believe they sought to enthrone Edward V, the very boy from whom they had taken the crown. The fact that Margaret of York and Stillington both had strong connections to George, Duke of Clarence, and thus every reason to support his son, is entirely overlooked. That Edward's name only began circulating when rumours spread that the real Edward Plantagenet had died in the Tower also fits this interpretation. To summarise, we have no source stating that Simnel was Edward V, one source naming him as Richard of Shrewsbury, a handful of sources calling him merely a son of King Edward, and numerous sources identifying him as Edward Plantagenet. For Simnel to be Edward V, large-scale document forgery must have taken place, and those not under Tudor control, including suppliers of arms and mercenaries to Simnel, must also have colluded in the deception. Edward V would then have been willing to trust the very men who had taken from him his family, his fortune, his name, and his crown. And for all of this to work, he would also have had to look like a 10-year-old. This is absurd. This brings us to the question of Elizabeth Woodville's possible support. Even among Ricardians, there is agreement that she would have supported Simnel only if he had been her son. She had nothing to gain from placing George's son on the throne. Her own daughter was queen. Such a move would have been a downgrade. For Elizabeth, this would have meant working alongside the very men who had beheaded her son Richard and her brother Anthony, trusting those who had denounced her marriage as invalid, stripped her of her property, and deprived her sons of the crown. And she was now expected to believe that these same men would put Edward on the throne, when the leader of the enterprise was John de la Pole, Richard's presumed heir. What could possibly have moved her to such an action? The old theory is often cited here that Elizabeth had learned the Tudors had murdered her sons. Yet this collapses if Simnel were Edward V, then the Tudors could only have killed one prince at most. And Elizabeth is now supposed to entrust her remaining son to the very men who had already harmed her family. Even if we assume the princes did not die in the Tower, but were secretly sent abroad, we would still be demanding that the Queen work with the murderers of her kin, men who had branded her a witch. She could just as easily have left her daughter on the throne, secure in the knowledge that her entire family was safe. As we know, Simnel survived his rebellion and later served at court. Since Elizabeth Woodville visited there several times after her retirement, she must have seen him. The same applies to Elizabeth of York. Yet there is no record of anyone ever suspecting that Simnel might in fact have been King Edward V. Elizabeth Woodville does not mention either of her sons in her will or on her epitaph. Edward's name did appear in Elizabeth of York's first epitaph, so it was certainly possible to remember him. So far, no one has been able to give a conclusive explanation of what Elizabeth Woodville's alleged support for Simnel might have entailed. There is not even confirmation that she knew of his existence. The only scrap of evidence that might, by a stretch of the imagination, point in this direction is the brief imprisonment of her son Thomas Grey by Henry VII when Simnel appeared. Yet the two men already had a history. Grey had sought to return to England from exile in Brittany in 1484, which made Henry wary of him. That this mistrust did not extend to the entire family is shown by the fact that Edward Woodville served as one of Henry's commanders at the Battle of Stoke. Elizabeth recovered lands in 1486, but not large sums of money. She had no resources with which to finance Simnel's troops, nor would she have needed them, since we know exactly where the funds came from. All in all, then, no, Lambert Simnel was not Edward V. He did not pretend to be Edward V, and he was not supported by Elizabeth Woodville. Why, then, does this rumor persist? The answer is simple. Some Ricardians are determined to clear Richard III of any suspicion in the matter of the princes in the Tower, no matter the cost. This can only be done if the princes are believed to have survived. And so we end up with the absurd fiction that we are forced to address today. Let us be clear. Nothing I have said here proves that Richard III murdered the princes in the Tower. It proves only that Lambert Simnel was not Edward V, and that Elizabeth Woodville was not among his supporters. The arguments I have presented may not convince everyone. Some will continue to insist that Lambert Simnel was Edward V, and that Elizabeth Woodville supported him to the point of exile in a monastery. But the role of a historian is not to declare absolute truths, nor to settle debates by force, but to help us better understand the past through evidence and reasoned argument. When faced with competing claims, each of us must ask, which explanation helps us understand the complexities of history more clearly, or at least, which one withstands scrutiny better? In this case, the evidence shows that Simnel was not Edward V, and that Elizabeth Woodville was not his supporter. This does not prove or disprove Richard III's guilt regarding the princes in the Tower. It simply clarifies what Simnel's identity was not and who did not back him. That alone is a step toward a clearer understanding of this tangled chapter of history. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.